Benvingudes i benvinguts a aquest seminari internacional sobre masculinitats, política i afectes que coorganitzem entre la Unitat d'Igualtat de la UOC i el grup de recerca MEDUSA Genders en Transició, Masculinitats, Cossos i Afectes. Aquest seminari s'emmarca en el mes de novembre, on sabeu que hi ha una fita importantíssima en la lluita contra les violències masclistes, que és el dia 25. I per tant, en aquest seminari el que volem és acostar-nos, apropar-nos i donar eines a entendre i per tant combatre aquesta lacra social que és la violència masclista i tot tipus de violència en general. I em sembla que en els temps en els que estem toca dir això també, que no només les violències masclistes s'han de combatre, sinó tot tipus de violència contra tot tipus de persones. Bé, les masculinitats, com segurament sabeu, han estat la germana petita, per dir-ho d'alguna manera, dels estudis de gènere. No va ser fins als anys 90 que els gender studies van començar amb una reflexió important, crítica, sobre quin paper juguen fonamental les masculinitats en les relacions de gènere, atenent sobretot a la qüestió de com s'exerceix el poder des de les masculinitats i com combatre uns privilegis que donen lloc a desigualtats i injustícia. En aquest camp de les masculinitats s'emmarca la recerca del nostre grup de recerca, valgui la redundància, i s'emmarca la conferència magistral que ens farà avui la professora Birgit Sauer, a qui presentaré en breu. Si sempre, per mi, almenys des de la meva perspectiva, l'estudi de les masculinitats ha estat una peça clau en la comprensió de com funcionen, actuen i què fan les relacions de gènere, avui en dia, si cal, l'estudi de les masculinitats és més urgent perquè estem assistint al que alguns acadèmics diuen un revival del masculinisme, és a dir, una reivindicació de formes de masculinitat tradicionals que són instrumentalitzades políticament, sobretot per posicions de la dreta i l'extrema dreta arreu del món, però també aquí a Europa, a casa nostra. Per tant, ara mateix és urgent aprofundir en quines masculinitats estan circulant, com es produeixen, quins cossos fan, quins efectes tenen, com s'instrumentalitzen políticament i per què sembla ser és tan fàcil instrumentalitzar-les políticament. I en aquest sentit, els afectes juguen un paper fonamental. S'ha dit que el gènere és un pegamento simbólico, una cola simbòlica, un symbolic glue, però en aquest pegamento simbòlico que fa emergir diferents elements que ara estan actuant en els populismes d'extrema dreta, com la xenofòbia, el fonamentalisme religiós, el racisme, etc., els afectes no tenen ni molt menys un paper menor. Per tant, crec que ara és el moment d'abordar aquesta relació entre gènere, afectes i política i crec que la millor persona per fer-ho és la convidada de la primera part d'aquesta sessió. Com sabeu, debatrem sobre aquest tema en dues parts. La primera part consistirà en una conferència magistral de la professora, de la catedràtica Birgit Sauer. Després tindrem un petit break i passarem a una taula redona amb la participació de la catedràtica Birgit Sauer, el professor Diego Falconi de l'Autònoma de Barcelona i Alexandre Pitcher, becari ECTU predoctoral en aquesta benvolguda casa. Si em permeteu, passe ja, sense més dilació, a presentar a la professora Birgit Sauer. Ho faré en anglès perquè tinc el seu currículum en anglès i traduir igual és massa arriscat. Birgit Sauer is Emeritus Professor of Political Science at the University of Vienna. From 2018 to 2022, she was Deputy Speaker of the research platform GAME, Gender and Ambivalent Invisibilities. Her research fields include right-wing populism and gender, Migration and Gender, Feminist State Theory, and Politics of Emotions and Affects. She was a member of several EU research projects, including projects on right-wing populism and media, gender and right-wing populism, violence against women, gender, migration, and religion. She also conducted research on affective state transformation. Her recent publications include Otto Pence and Birgit Sauer, Governing Affect, Neoliberalism, Neo-Bureaucracies, and Service Work in Routledge 2020, and Birgit Sauer and Otto Pence, Conjuncture der Männlichkeit, Affective Strategien der autoritären Rechten.
Muy bien.
Thank you very much. Vielen Dank. It is a pleasure, my honor, to give you the floor, Professor Birgit Sauer. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Begonia, for inviting me to this event. Thanks for coming. And I'll share mainly the thoughts of the last book, which was published in German. And yes, I tried to translate some of the main issue. And it's about the conjuncture of masculinity and the affective strategies of the authoritarian right in Germany and in Austria. And I just say something about the two countries in a minute, why we selected the two countries. So, but what we can see since the turn of the century is that Europe, but also other regions of the world, are confronted with the growth of right-wing populist, right-wing nationalist, and authoritarian parties. Some of these parties are in government, others build government coalitions, as for instance the Austrian right-wing Freedom Party, the FPÖ. The party was in government 2 times since the turn of the century. And all these nationalist right-wing parties seem to have one major topic, and this is their mobilization against migration, against the right to asylum, and against refugees. However, what I found in the projects I did over the last years, gender and sexuality are also very important mobilizing issues of these right-wing parties and also across the globe. And at one point I thought, well, these right-wing actors, they are obsessed by gender and sexuality issues. And they joined the global anti-gender movement, which was initially launched by the Vatican after the Beijing UN conference on women in 1995, but mainly all right-wing parties across the globe joined this movement. So, and my interest tonight and in the book is to explain this right-wing obsession with gender, and especially against the background that in political science literature, these right-wing parties are labeled as men's parties. And this label, men's parties, refers mainly to male leadership of the parties, although we know that this male leadership is changing because some of these parties have female leading figures, just as Giorgia Meloni in Italy or Marine Le Pen in France, but also in Germany, Alice Weidel. I don't know if you have heard about her. She's a very interesting figure because she is a lesbian mother living together with her partner. They have 2 children together, and she's the leading figure of the German Alternative for Germany. So her name is Alice Weidel. But nevertheless, I think if we look globally, we can see that this label men's party is true also with respect to leadership. But there is also another dimension why right-wing parties are labeled men's parties, and this refers to the electorate. So the electorate of these right-wing parties is male, and that's why I'm interested in what we say as political scientists, in the supply side. What do these right-wing parties offer to specific groups of men in order to gain their vote? So, and in my talk tonight, I'd like to demonstrate that these right-wing parties propagate what I label a masculinist identity politics. And with this masculinist identity politics, they want to appeal to specific groups of men by interpolating, nevertheless, different forms of masculinity. So there are, and I'll point out some forms of these masculinities. And of course, this strategy of a masculinist identity politics is highly affective and highly emotional, as it is grounded, as I will show later, in a moral, gender, and sexuality panic. So the authoritarian right's obsession with gender, sexuality, and its masculinist identity politics, I will argue, are linked to the larger project of the authoritarian right, which is, I would say, an anti-democratic project. And in their struggle for cultural hegemony and in their struggle to gain to get into political power, they use gender and sexuality to create this cultural hegemony. As I already mentioned, my analysis refers mainly to parties and organizations in Germany and in Austria. And the two countries have similarities with respect to right-wing parties, but they have also differences. Both countries have a long history of right-wing extremism, which resulted in the 1930s in National Socialism, or first in fascism in Austria, but then in National Socialism as in Germany. But these right-wing groups, they didn't disappear after National Socialism, but they had different life trajectories. So in the Federal Republic of Germany, there were only marginal right-wing parties. They were not very successful after World War II, but there were quite a few right-wing extremist organizations which remained in the shadow of liberal democracy. The Alternative for Germany, who is now winning votes in a really great amount on the national, but also especially on the Länder level. This party, Alternative for Germany, or AfD, was only founded in 2013, which is rather late. But it developed into a major right-wing challenge to Germany's liberal democracy. In contrast to that, the Austrian Freedom Party, the FPÖ, has a long history since World War II. The forerunner of the FPÖ was already founded in 1949, so right after the Second World War, and it was especially meant as a successor party of the National Socialist Party. So a lot of Nazis went into this, it was called Verband der Unabhängigen, and then this party reorganized itself as Freedom Party in 1956, being also rather marginal only until Jörg Haider, I guess he was one of the most famous right-wingers in Europe, when he seized the power of the party in 1986. So then the party started to win votes, and as I said, was in 3 national governments since then. So theoretically, my analysis of the mainly publications, but also online publications of the parties, this analysis is based in critical masculinity studies on the one hand, and on the other hand on Stuart Hall's and Lawrence Grossberg's notion of a conjuncture. And this notion of a conjuncture differs from the economic notion of a conjuncture, which means the up and downs of the economy. But Hall and Grossberg refer with this notion of conjuncture to processes in which rather ambivalent or contradictory social developments or crises are put together, are conjoined. That's what they mean with the conjuncture, how these developments are put together into one consistent narrative, and also then into a new societal and political trajectory. And in my talk, I'd like to show that and how the authoritarian right in Germany and Austria modulates such a new conjuncture, which I label an authoritarian masculinist conjuncture. How will I argue? I'll first outline the neoliberal conjuncture, which I think is important to understand the emergence and the growth of the right-wingers. And then secondly, I will analyze how the right-wing parties address gender and sexuality in their communication, and I'll analyze their narratives of threat and fear and their invocation of what I would label a crisis of white masculinity. In the third step, I will outline the right-wing proposed solutions, and this is what I label then masculinist identity politics. And then fourth, I'll address the excess of affectivity, which is associated with this right-wing mobilization strategy, and which I think is also rooted in the neoliberal conjuncture. And in the final step, I'll very briefly point out how this authoritarian masculinist conjuncture feeds into the anti-democratic project of the right-wingers. So to my first point, neoliberal transformations and the crisis of authority. Neoliberal developments in Germany as well as in Austria are characterized by multiple crises. The neoliberal restructuring of European societies has not only led to the dominance of market forces in all areas of society, but also especially in the dismantling of the welfare state, the deregulation of labor, and the reduction of wages. And this led in particular to an increasing precarization of the everyday life of many people. Jobs are no longer secure. Social benefits, just such as health and pension insurance, have been partially privatized. And this resulted in the financialization of the everyday lives of working people. And again, this financialization also resulted in a sort of disciplination through debt, because people all are indebted. So in addition, neoliberal globalization and growth ideology depend on an ever further exploitation of natural resources. But what is even more important with respect to gender issue is the neoliberal valorization of women's work. Women are no longer to be merely seen as housewives, but were interpolated as employed, and they were integrated into the labor market. And this was accompanied by a reduction of the so-called family wage, and at the same time by the creation of a low-wage sector, which mainly female and migrant workers. But this integration of women into the labor market came also along with further gender or women's equality measures. And these equality measures made women more visible, not only on the labor market, but also in the media and in the political sphere. So consequently, the institution of the male breadwinner partially eroded. However, this form of neoliberal gender equality remained ambivalent for women because care work in the two countries is still privatized. Women are still responsible for childcare, for care of sick and elderly people. So, and another dimension of this, what Nancy Fraser called progressive neoliberalism, mainly women's advancement, for instance, another dimension is the recognition of diversity, be it equality of homosexuals in marriage law, be it the multiplicity of gender identities in the personal status laws of the two countries, or be the erosion of a gender binary expressed, for instance, in the German so-called self-determination law for trans people. Overall, this neoliberal restructuring resulted in constellations of insecurity, individualization, and mostly desolidarization. The consequences of this neoliberal economic precarization were not cushioned emotionally in people's everyday lives, and thus provoked fear of, for instance, losing one's job or losing income and social rights. Political elites and mainstream parties are less and less willing or less and less able to establish a social consensus. And this creates what Antonio Gramsci calls a crisis of authority in liberal democracies. And I think this is just where right-wing authoritarian parties jump in and they exploit these contradictory developments of the neoliberal conjuncture, and especially this crisis of authority. And I'll turn to the second point, to the anti-gender mobilization of the authoritarian right. As I said, European right-wingers about 10 years ago joined the so-called anti-genderist movement. And their anti-gender mobilization creates a moral gender and sexuality panic. Deconstructive gender studies, gender mainstreaming, and LGBTIQ rights, they claim, they endanger societies. The deconstruction of a distinct and hierarchical gender binary not only poses a threat to the alleged natural order between men and women, but also to the heterosexual nuclear family and the nation. A member of parliament from the FPÖ in Austria, by drawing on declining birth rates in Austria, he blames Austrian women to be birth refusers, and they risk that Austrians will die out. And in a similar nativist biopolitical argument, the German politician Thilo Sarrazin, he's a right-wing social democrat, but he published a book titled Germany Does Away with Itself, which is very welcomed by all right-wingers in the German-speaking countries, making the same argument: Germany will die out because women are not giving birth to enough children. But these arguments, of course, as you can imagine, include the racist idea of Muslims outnumbering the autochthonous population and thus creating a threat to the nativist people. FPÖ and AfD furthermore criticize the supposedly excessive equality policies under the label of gender mainstreaming. And what they say is that women's policies of the 1970s had already achieved equality between women and men, and so that there was nothing more to be done in terms of equality. So the right-wing antagonistic strategy, on the one hand, blames political elites, be it mainstream media, be it feminists, but also gender studies, for this situation. And on the other hand, not only blaming the elite, but identifying the people as a victim. But the largest victim group in this authoritarian right narratives are men. And I want to highlight only 7 topics, there are even more, which are discursively activated to present white men as victims of these political and intellectual elites. So the first topic is that all men right-wing actors claim are suspected to be sexual perpetrators by the alleged defamatory anti-violence laws. The second topic is that fathers in particular are perceived as victims of unjust divorce laws which favor mothers that rob men of their children. The third topic refers to boys, and boys, according to this right-wing narrative, are victims of female teachers and equality policies at schools. There at schools, boys are forced to adapt to girls' behavior and therefore are prevented to learn masculine values such as courage and risk-taking. Boys are raised, as one of the most famous German right-wingers, Björn Höcke, claims, boys are raised to be wimps. The fourth point refers to this. Men, therefore, have lost self-confidence and have difficulties to find female partners. This is an argument by Maximilian Krah. Maybe we hear about him next year because he's the top candidate of the AfD for the EU elections. And he only recently launched a Twitter video where he said, well, German boys and young men are unable to find female partners. And this is not the only narrative that demonstrates how these right-wingers refer and borrow their arguments from very masculinist men's groups, so be it incels, the involuntary celibates, or fathers' rights activists. So the fifth topic is that this threat scenario is put together in the argument of a feminization of society. And this feminization of society is a general threat to the good old Western order of societies. I think this argument of a feminization of European culture and society is a very old topic which emerged already at the turn from the 19th to the 20th century, but it developed into an important dimension of today's authoritarian right-wing discourse. The sixth point is that men are perceived as endangered by the other sexuality. And this could be homosexuality, transsexuality, or by the sexuality of migrant men. So the authoritarian right And here I refer especially to La Groupe Identitaire, the identitarian group. And they exist in both countries, in Austria and in Germany. I'm not sure if they exist in Spain. They warn against the so-called homo lobby, and especially in recent years, they activate against the so-called trans lobby. And they say both of these lobbies negatively influence children and destroy their national sexual and gender identity. And furthermore, right-wing debates point to, and this is the second dimension of this other sexuality, they point to the threat of an alleged non-domesticated, wild, archaic, and patriarchal sexuality of Muslim men, while Western masculinity is presented as domesticated and feminized, and therefore running the risk of becoming a victim of the other, the migrant or Muslim sexuality. And in this vein, the authoritarian right in both countries exploited the sexual assaults against women on New Year's Eve 2015 in some German countries, some German cities. Of course, they wanted to stir up resentments against Muslim migrants because this was just after the summer of migration. But nevertheless, they also want to present German or Austrian men as endangered by migrant sexuality. At the same time, when I read all these argumentations, it seems that there is also a desire for this other non-domesticated sexuality in the right-wing discourse. And the seventh and last point, according to the right-wing narrative, these sexualized assaults in these German cities also highlight the weakness of white men who are no longer able to protect their women, as again Björn Höcke from the German AfD stressed. Of course, this argument includes that white women are seen to be the property of white men. But at the same time, violence against women is externalized because violence is presented as being imported by the supposed others, while white men are seen as non-violent. So to sum up, the authoritarian right uses gender and sexuality issues to drastically demonstrate a crisis of white masculinity and hence a comprehensive loss of order, control, and security. And in this vein, I again quote Björn Höcke from the AfD in a party rally again in autumn 2015, so right after the summer of migration, when a lot of migrants entered Germany, in this party rally, and he gave a speech, and I quote, "We have to rediscover our masculinity. Only if we rediscover our masculinity, we will be manful. And only if we are manful, we will be fortified. And we have to become fortified, dear friends." End of quote. So conjuring a crisis of white masculinity is an important element to modulate a new masculinist conjuncture. And this masculinist conjuncture re-signifies neoliberal losses and growing social inequality as being caused by female labor market integration, by gender and sexuality equality, and of course, by migration. But this new conjuncture needs also solutions to this crisis of masculinity, and I turn to my third point, to the masculinist identity politics. So against this crisis of this against this background of this conjured crisis of masculinity, the authoritarian right claims to compensate the losses and to solve the crisis of white masculinity. So this right-wing communication contains the promise that a charismatic masculinized leader, which I think could also be a woman, that this leader can provide these groups of male victims with new self-security and could fulfill their wish for a better future. And in this sense, again, Maximilian Krah, the EU candidate of the AfD, in the already mentioned Twitter video, tried to convince white boys that they should not persuade themselves to be, quote, sweet, soft, weak, and leftist, quote, end of quote. Instead, he says, men should be strong, patriotic, and of course, right-wing. With such an attitude, Krah promises frustrated straight men in the Twitter video, quote, you'll also find a girlfriend, end of quote. So authoritarian right-wing actors promise to give back agency and control over one's lives through the re-sovereignization of masculinity and the reaffirmation of male supremacy. They offer to re-establish old certainties, for instance, a hierarchical heterosexual gender binary and a traditional gender division of labor, with a male family breadwinner and the woman as mother and housewife. This promise is a type, I would say, of a sort of patriarchal hegemonic masculinity, which nevertheless includes a heteronormative and racist component. The identitarian movement, again, for instance, propagates what they label a white boy month instead or against the LGBTIQ Pride Month. And Björn Höcke from the AfD wants to counter the supposed crisis of masculinity with another type of hegemonic masculinity, not with patriarchal masculinity, but with a heroic, militaristic, and muscular masculinity. He refers to the revaluation of male-coded characteristics such as fortitude, while an Austrian right-winger, he praises courage and risk that men should relearn again. Both politicians suggest the restoration of an autonomous male subject with a right to aggressiveness, but also with a right to love within heterosexual relationships and family arrangements. And finally, this argumentation figure of sovereign masculinity is also suitable for elevating white men as protectors of their women against migrant men. Yet another aspect I think is relevant. The denial of the climate catastrophe by most of the authoritarian parties can also be interpreted as part of their masculinist identity politics, because this denial allows men to lull themselves into the certainty that they can continue to live out their petro-masculinity, meaning their desire for big cars. So what I mentioned now, this is what I mean with masculinist identity politics, namely the promise to create a hegemonic white masculinist identity. And this identity politics is, of course, finally linked to a national identity politics. So the return to traditional gender and sexuality relations is connected with a ethno-nationalist formation of the people. And this nativist biopolitical project promises exclusive notions of solidarity and of social cohesion, but of course excludes or even wipes out groups of people defined as others. Thus, masculinist identity politics is not only connected to biopower in the Foucauldian sense, to create the people, but it is also connected to necropower, to use the words of Akhil Mbembe. Those who are not seen to belong to the nativist people are dehumanized, should be expelled and excluded from the body politics, like, for instance, the refugees in the Mediterranean Sea. I suggest to label this type of masculinity as necromasculinity. And when I thought of this figure of necromasculinity, it was immediately Vladimir Putin who came to my mind. I think he's a good example for how authoritarian muscular masculinity, and I think you remember Putin performing publicly bare-chested, how this muscular masculinity is transformed into necro-masculinity when Putin is legitimizing the war against Ukraine, now wearing suit and tie. So these masculinist offers by the authoritarian right, and in both countries the right-wingers legitimized the Russian war against Ukraine. So these masculinist offers are, I would say, also attractive to certain groups of women. And these could be women who feel overwhelmed in the face of growing social inequalities and in the increasing compulsion to be employed despite family obligations and despite a lack of care infrastructure. Women who are exhausted by the double burden of neoliberal emancipation might long for a male hero or savior and perceive masculinist constellations as a new chance to agency. My fourth point, the excess of affects. Like any moral panic, the right-wing authoritarian gender and sexuality panic is highly emotional and affective, be it fear of others, for instance, migrants, feminists, or gender equality politicians, or be it anger towards the elite or hatred against migrants and refugees. Gender and sexuality panics, as well as masculinist identity politics, are particularly well suited to establish cultural hegemony of the authoritarian right, because gender and sexuality have historically always been emotionally charged issues. Due to their affective physicality, gender and sexuality suit well for anchoring thought and feeling patterns about social relations in everyday life. For instance, the supposedly natural inequality between men and women can become a paradigm in the right-wing discourse for a fundamental inequality of people. Masculinity and affect meet in debates about thymos, the Platonian human motivation, by one of the AfD intellectuals, Mark Jongen. In the German right-wing think tank Institute for State Politics, it's a right-wing extremist think tank, Mark Jongen in 2016 held a speech on what the speech had the title Thymos training in the age of migration, and in this talk he refers to the rightful emphasis on anger and aggressiveness and the need to use these motivations and virtues against immigrants. So the authoritarian right-wing discourse entitles especially men to be furious, to be passionate, and of course then in the same way they are freed from care for others, but encouraged to modulate their fear into anger and to direct this anger towards alleged others, refugee, migrants, Muslims, and feminists. Authoritarian right-wing affective mobilization furthermore includes the promise for new forms of solidarity in times when traditional forms of solidarity, for instance in the welfare state, but also in the family, are eroding. But this right-wing solidarity is of course an exclusive solidarity based on welfare chauvinism and on nationalism. But nevertheless, it is promising hope and empathy within a group of similar people. And they try to create an exclusive, affective atmosphere and exclusive attunements between similar people. For the effective strategy of a masculinist identity politics, the authoritarian right can draw on an excess of affects and emotion that neoliberalism has already produced over the last 30 years. The neoliberal affective structure includes the fear of losing one's job or the shame of failing in competition. And competition and risk have become major characteristics of the neoliberal restructuring of economy and society. Only those who engage in risky competition become an entrepreneurial self, which is important for the neoliberal area, and only those acquire the right to become a successful and a full citizen. And an important further effective element of the neoliberal competition and risk repertoire is the effective mobilization against supposedly unsuccessful and against those who do not deserve certain social rights, the homeless, the unemployed, but also migrants. And this emotional exclusion is combined with pride in one's own, albeit often precarious achievements. The authoritarian right now takes up these ambivalent, contradictory, affective situation that neoliberalism created, and the right uses these contradictions to establish an authoritarian conjuncture. The right-wingers discursively exacerbate neoliberal feelings of insecurity, such as fear and shame, and offer compensation through anger and contempt. The authoritarian right's attempt to transform anxiety and fear into anger against others is a way of reclaiming control over one's lives which were sacrificed to neoliberal competition and risk-taking. So right-wing actors promise effective agency in a time where people have been deprived of agency and rights. Blaming the others can be seen as a relief and a way of de-responsabilization of men, especially their de-responsabilization of care, and at the same time to re-establish dominance through anger and aggression. Furthermore, authoritarian right-wing mobilization includes an effective claim for belonging, for love, for recognition, and for citizenship, albeit again exclusive affective citizenship. The discourse about love of one's country, the homeland, as well as feelings of belonging to a we and solidarity within this group is part of this affective identity politics. The threat to gender certainties became a focal point for justifying an authoritarian social order of security and control. Right-wing actors link threat, loss of control, and insecurity with the promise of security through leadership and disciplining. And this affective strategy of insecurity and victimhood might lead to authoritarian temptations, as the German sociologist Wilhelm Heidmayer writes. And these authoritarian temptations are used by right-wing actors to legitimize authoritarian solutions. So anti-gender struggles and white masculinist identity politics are effective strategies to create consensus for this authoritarian transformation. But with respect to authoritarian transformation, the authoritarian right can also draw on neoliberal developments, because the discourse of insecurity has already in the neoliberal era led to a policy of securitization of control and disciplining. So my last point, very briefly, the anti-democratic project. By referring to gender and sexuality, the authoritarian right constructs a specific notion of the people. And I think there are three discursive modes in which they do that. First, as the binary concept, gender, this concept builds in the binarity a paradigm for dividing societies into two distinct groups. And these two distinct groups eventually legitimize the fundamental inequality of people, and it also legitimizes social hierarchies. Secondly, gender symbolizes the natural, hegemonious, and pure people, and thus signifies an ethno-pluralist idea of the people and the rejection of a mix of different ethnicities. So this nativist populist politics rejects plurality and legitimizes securitization, a walling of the nation, and a walling out of migrants and refugees, as Wendy Brown has labeled this. And this is deeply grounded in necro-masculinism. And the third point, in the antagonistic frame, the people is constructed as weak and as passive, without agency. It is a deceived victim of elites. And this people needs to be saved from the seduction of corrupt elites and intellectual elites. And the savior is, of course, an authoritarian right-wing leader. So hence the interpellation of the people in right-wing populist political communication is one element of the quest for more political leadership and thus for more authoritarianism. Because in this argumentative figure, democracy as sovereignty of the people seems to be impossible due to the inequality of the people, due to the need of protection, hierarchy, and leadership. So the paternalistic and patriarchal image of the people results in an anti-democratic move. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Sauer. I think we would all agree that it was absolutely interesting, important, socially relevant, and politically necessary. Okay, so now let's open the debate. I don't know whether anybody had any question for Professor Sauer. Just to break the ice, I will start. Now kind of digging into the concept of crisis of masculinity, which is redundant argument in the kind of justification for these neo-masculinist politics we're having now. But if we look at the so-called crisis of masculinity, at least we can trace it back to the 19th century. I mean, masculinity has been talked about mostly always in terms of crisis. Probably because, as my dear anthropologist David Gilmour said, we know what masculinity is not much better than we know what it is. So there's nothing new in the idea that masculinity is under threat, is in crisis, but still these positions are resonating in people. I mean, it's not that they exist. My main problem, of course, my main problem is that they exist. That is the problem. But the thing is that they exist and that they resonate in people who vote them. Whereas there's not such a crisis of masculinity, or maybe there's always been a crisis of masculinity. And it resonates, for instance, without any kind of attention in my view, but you know much more about this, so I want to hear you, without any attention to cultural or national diversity. I mean, the same things, the same topics are now working. I think that's the word, working, in Germany, in Poland, in Hungary, in France, in Portugal, in Spain.
In Spain too.
So, crisis, there's no crisis, there's this neo-masculinist political effervescence in authoritarian terms, and then this erasure of diversity. How can we deal with this? What can we do?
What can we do? It's really, well, this is the big question. Whenever I present the book or similar arguments, so the question is, what can we do? But I would first agree, of course, there are a lot of narratives, a lot of affective narratives that we can trace back to the 19th century, to the start of modern politics. And there have also always been mainly right-wing extremists, right-wing actors who jumped on this sort of crisis of masculinity. So modernity was always seen as threatening, as feminized, so the masses are always seen as feminized, endangering the more masculinized political elites. And this is really a very long topos that can be traced back. And of course, what we see, it culminated in fascism, in National Socialism, and then we can see that after World War II, in the post-Nazi area, we can see that this narrative wasn't prominent anymore. So we had then, what we can see is that the welfare state did not deal with a sort of masculinity or femininity. In the two countries, Germany and Austria, it was clear that the post-World War II welfare state compromise was a male compromise. I wouldn't say a masculinist, but it was a male compromise because the welfare state excluded women. They were excluded from the labor market, and they were relegated to the sphere of the family. So it was, we could say, nevertheless, a sort of masculinist society that was reestablished, but without a masculinist narrative. It was a welfare state narrative, which praised, nevertheless, mothers. But then what we could see in the neoliberal conjuncture, as I said, well, just broke with this welfare state compromise, not saying, well, this is a male compromise and we don't need it, but saying, well, we need female labor force. And I would say, so this is the background for the emergence of these masculinist right in different senses, because there was a real, I would say, precarization of male labor force, and at the same time there was the integration of a female labor force into the economy, but which was at the same time very precarious. I don't know how it was in Spain, but in Germany and in Austria, women work mainly part-time. So although there was this discourse of integrating women into the labor market, the total amount of hours that women work did not grow. So more women are integrated, but they mainly work part-time. But nevertheless, so this was the moment when also affirmative action made women more visible in the media, in politics, but also women had when they had their own money, they were more free. So, and the divorce rates were raising because women just left the men when they had at least a little bit of money. So there was, and this was then used by the right-wingers to create this victimized group of men against the background of neoliberal precarization. There could have been other solutions, I would have said, if there would have been a critical men's movement which would have politicized the issue that men are not longer seen as male breadwinners of the family, but that they could be fathers, that they could be whatever they want, that they could take on different identities and this plurality and diversity. But this did not happen in the two countries. So, and I think this needs to be explained why a critical men's movement didn't emerge, but that this masculinist men's movement were so successful at that, and that the right-wingers were able to take this up. As I said, they in Austria it was really obvious with the first right-wing government, when the right-wingers were in a government coalition with the Christian Conservative Party. They established what they labeled a sort of a men's ministry, or at least a section for men. And these were all fathers' rights activists there. So they just closed down the women's ministry and established this section for men. And there you can see that they started, and this was in the late 1990s, I think 2000s. There they already started this masculinist mobilization. Yeah, and I think it's successful. It works against the background of these feelings of loss of control over one's own life, of precarization, and there should have been, I would say, a sort of compensatory discourse, or there could have been a compensatory discourse, because now we all know that at least the generation I work with at the university, everybody says, I do not want to have a 40 hours week. No, I want to have time to care for myself. I want to have time to care for children, for partners, for who else. And so this is another project of a social welfare state, to take care of oneself and to take care of others. So, and I think and this is also a solution in the book. Of course, we have to stop with this neoliberal conjuncture, with this idea of competition and risk and fighting against each other, and that we should establish what could be, well, in España it's a care strike, or in German there is this idea of care revolution, where we would say we just need an excess of care for others, for oneself, and that we need to institutionalize these spaces of care, this time of care, and where the issue of caring for others could be discussed. I think it needs spaces. I think one of the space could be work environments. I don't think that it needs to be on the weekend, but it needs to be during work, where we work. Well, these could be participatory spaces where people are encouraged to feel their feeling, to talk about their feeling, and to all feelings that appear. And I think this could be a way of dealing with this aggressiveness, with this strong masculinity, to just engage in debates, in democratic spaces where people could participate on an everyday basis on issues that are important for their lives, be it, as I said, on the workplace, be it at schools, be it in the neighborhood. I think in neighborhood surroundings, there are already some experiments going on where these debates and caring for oneself, for the surrounding, for the neighborhood, but also for others living there, where this is already practiced. I think we do not have to invent everything new, but there are already practices in this direction.